The ground didn't just shake, it screamed. 1 minute Jacob Hartwell was fixing a fence post, the Montana sun beating down on his neck. The next, the whole world was coming apart at the seams. Duchess, his mare, screamed too. A sound of pure animal terror as the earth bucked like a wild horse. It wasn't just a tremor, the kind that rattles windows and spills coffee. This was different. This felt like the planet itself was tearing in two, right under his boots. He clung to the fence post, his knuckles white, watching in disbelief as a crack, a deep dark wound ripped across his pasture. It wasn't a jagged tear. It was a perfectly straight line, as if a giant had dragged a razor blade across the prairie. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The silence that followed was louder than the quake. Dust settled. Birds started singing again, confused. Duchess trembled beside him, her eyes wide. But Jacob couldn't look away from the gash in his land. It was about 10 feet long and maybe 3 feet wide, a black scar on the golden grass. He crept closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. Cool, ancient-smelling air drifted up from the darkness, a scent of damp stone and something else. Something metallic and strange. He peered in, but saw only blackness. This wasn't just a crack from an earthquake. This was an opening. Something had been waiting down there, waiting for this exact moment to be revealed. He dropped a pebble into the void and listened. It didn't just thud. It clattered, echoing off what sounded like walls. Multiple walls. He dropped a larger rock. The echoes confirmed it. This wasn't a cave. It was a structure. Man-made. Buried for God knows how long, right under the land he'd worked for years. His lonely, empty land. He stood there for a long time, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. As darkness began to creep in from the east, he saw something on the distant ridge. A lone rider, a silhouette against the dying light. The figure sat perfectly still on his horse, watching. Just watching. Jacob felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. He wasn't alone out here. And he had a terrible feeling that his life, the quiet, miserable life he had known, was officially over. The rope burned his hands as he lowered himself into the earth. The air grew colder with every foot he descended, the smell of ancient dust filling his lungs. His lantern cast wild, dancing shadows on the walls. And that's when he saw them. The walls weren't rough stone. They were smooth, polished, and covered in carvings, symbols and lines that twisted and coiled like sleeping snakes. Nothing like he'd ever seen. He'd only gone to school for a few years, but he knew this wasn't any Indian writing he was familiar with. This was something else entirely. Something older. His boots hit solid ground with a soft thud. He was 20 feet down, and the narrow fissure had opened into a room. A perfect, square room. He held the lantern high, his breath catching in his throat. It looked like the people who lived here had just stepped out for a minute. Clay pots with intricate paintings sat on stone shelves. Spears with gleaming, untarnished metal tips hung from hooks. The paintings on the pots showed animals he knew. Bison, bears, eagles, but also creatures from nightmares, things with too many legs and eyes that glowed. Then he saw the far wall. His blood ran cold. It was a mural, the colors so bright they could have been painted yesterday. It showed people in strange, flowing clothes living and working on his land. The hills, the creek, the distant mountains. It was all there, exactly as it was above ground. In the center of it all stood a woman with hair as black as a raven's wing. She was holding a small, glowing object, and all the other people were kneeling before her. Her face was kind, but stern, like she held the secrets of the universe in her hands. In the middle of the room sat a stone table, a single, massive slab covered in the same symbols as the walls. Jacob set his lantern on it. The stone felt warm, not hot, just alive. He ran his fingers over the carvings and noticed a faint, rectangular outline in the center. A lid. This wasn't a table. It was a chest, a stone sarcophagus. He tried to lift it, to push it, but it was sealed tight, as if it had been fused with the table itself. He searched the room, frantic now. Behind some pottery, he found a set of small, finely made metal tools. They weren't rusted. They looked brand new. He noticed tiny, almost invisible grooves around the edge of the stone lid. One of the tools fit perfectly. He slid it in. Click. He found another groove, another tool. Click. 6 times he did this, his hands trembling. With the final click, a low grinding sound echoed through the chamber. The lid shifted. Jacob pushed, and with a surprising lack of effort, the heavy stone slid away. Inside, the space was lined with a shimmering, silvery metal. Resting on beds of ancient, unrotted cloth were artifacts that made his mind reel. Maps, drawn on a material that felt like thin, flexible metal, showing his land and the surrounding territories, but marked with hundreds of strange symbols. Beneath the maps were plates of the same metal, covered in the strange, snake-like writing. They felt warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with a faint, inner light. At the very bottom, wrapped in its own special cloth, was a small crystal figurine. It was the woman from the mural, her hands cupped, holding a tiny, glowing spark. Jacob reached out and touched it. The moment his skin made contact, a chorus of voices flooded his mind. Whispers in a language he'd never heard but somehow understood. They were warning him. A great danger was coming. He had to protect this place. He snatched his hand back as if burned, his heart trying to beat its way out of his chest. It was just his imagination. Too long underground. But as he stumbled back and grabbed his rope to climb out, a single clear thought, not his own, echoed in his skull. They know. They are coming. When he finally clawed his way back to the surface, gasping in the night air, he looked toward the ridge. The lone rider was gone. But Jacob knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the whispers were right. He had just opened a door that could never be closed again. She appeared on his porch 2 days later, like a ghost drifting in on the morning fog. Her dress was practical, her boots dusty from a long journey, but her eyes were as sharp as shards of obsidian. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice steady. "My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez. I'm from the Smithsonian Institution. I believe you've found something." Jacob's hand went to the shotgun he now kept leaning by the door. "Don't know what you're talking about, ma'am." She gave a small, sad smile. "Mr. Hartwell, please. Word travels fast. An earthquake. A new fissure on your land. Talk in town as you've been acting strange." She opened the leather satchel at her side and pulled out a worn notebook. She flipped it open to a page filled with drawings. Jacob's stomach turned to ice. They were the symbols. The exact same symbols from the tunnel walls. "I've seen these before," she said softly. "In Arizona. And Colorado. Small sites, fragments of a civilization that isn't supposed to exist. A people who were here long before the natives we know, with a technology we can't explain." She looked up, her dark eyes boring into his. In every single case, the person who made the discovery was visited by representatives of the railroad. And within a month, every one of them either sold their land for a fraction of its worth, or they disappeared. Their ranches burned. They were never seen again. The air in the small cabin suddenly felt thin. She knew. She knew what was coming. "I'm here," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Because I want to make sure that doesn't happen to you. I need to see what you found." Before Jacob could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed up the road. Not one horse, but several. Elena's face went pale. "It's too late," she breathed. Jacob looked out the window. 3 men were riding toward his house. The man in the lead wore a fine black suit that cost more than Jacob's entire ranch. His smile was wide and predatory. Behind him were 2 men with the dead eyes of hired guns. "That's Cornelius Blake," Elena whispered, a note of fear in her voice. "He's the one. He bought all the other properties." Blake dismounted, his expensive boots crunching on the dry dirt. "Mr. Hartwell," he called out, his voice a buttery smooth threat. "I'm Cornelius Blake of the Montana Western Railroad. I hear you've been doing some digging. I'm here to make you a very generous offer." Jacob stepped onto the porch, his shotgun held low but ready. "My land's not for sale." Blake chuckled, a sound with no humor in it. "Oh, everything's for sale, my friend. I'm prepared to offer you $5,000, a fortune for a place like this." When Jacob didn't respond, Blake's eyes narrowed. "Don't be a fool, Hartwell. What you have under your land doesn't belong to you. It belongs to progress. It belongs to me." Elena stepped out from behind Jacob. "This site is of immense historical value, Mr. Blake. You can't just—" Blake cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Dr. Vasquez, chasing your little fairy tales again, I see. This is the real world, Doctor. And in the real world, men like me take what we want." He took a step closer to the porch, his voice dropping. "I've done my research on you, Hartwell. A lonely man, a widower. Sad story about your wife, Martha. Such a terrible fever. A shame you couldn't save her." Rage, pure and white-hot, flooded Jacob's vision. "You leave her out of this." Blake's smile was a slash of triumph. "People talk. They say a man who can't even protect his own family is weak. They might start to wonder if there are other things you're hiding, other failures. Maybe that fever wasn't an accident." That was it. Jacob raised the shotgun. Blake's men drew their pistols in a flash. The world held its breath. And in that moment of deadly silence, another rider appeared. "That's enough, Blake." Sheriff Rodriguez sat on his horse at the end of the lane, his hand resting on his own gun. "This is official business, Sheriff," Blake snarled. "Funny," the sheriff said, pulling a folded telegram from his pocket. "So is this. Came in this morning from the territorial governor himself. Seems Dr. Vasquez here was busy last night. This entire property is now under federal protection as a site of archaeological importance. You and your men are trespassing." Blake's face went from smug to purple with rage. He stared at Elena, then at Jacob, his eyes promising murder. "This isn't over," he spat, climbing back on his horse. "There are other ways. Accidents happen. Fires start. People disappear." As they rode away, the sheriff looked at Jacob, his expression grim. "He's not bluffing. That man is poison. You two need to watch your backs, because he will be back." The sun bled across the horizon as they descended back into the tunnel. The air felt heavy, charged with the day's conflict. They had to get the artifacts out. They had to hide them before Blake came back, and they both knew he would come back tonight. "I've been having dreams," Jacob said, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "Since the first day I came down here. I see the people from the mural. I hear their whispers. They're afraid of something." Elena, busy examining the locking mechanism on the stone chest, paused. "What are they afraid of, Jacob?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think this chest wasn't meant to be opened. I think it was meant to keep something in." He looked at the murals, at the fleeing figures. They weren't just running from enemies. They were running from a shadow, a formless darkness that seemed to swallow the light. Elena traced the symbols on the chest lid. "These aren't just locks, Jacob. It's a sequence, a story. It tells of a gift and a curse." Before she could say more, a muffled shout came from above ground. Then the sound of splintering wood. His front door. "They're here," Jacob breathed, blowing out the lantern. Darkness, absolute and suffocating, swallowed them. They could hear boots stomping on the cabin floorboards above, Blake's angry voice barking orders. "Find the entrance. They have to be down here." "There's another way out," Jacob whispered, grabbing Elena's arm. "A small fissure back here. It leads toward the creek." "We can't leave the artifacts," she hissed back. "Then we open it. Now!" In the pitch black, guided only by touch and memory, Elena's fingers flew across the stone lid, pressing the symbols in the sequence she had deciphered. Each press made a soft, grinding click. The sounds from above grew louder. They were at the main entrance now, their torchlight beginning to flicker down the shaft. "Hurry!" Jacob urged. Elena pressed the final symbol. With a deep sigh, like a dying breath, the stone lid slid open. A faint blue light emanated from within, casting their faces in a ghostly glow. Inside were the metal plates, pulsing with that strange inner light. "Take them," Jacob said, stuffing the warm plates into Elena's satchel. All of them. A new voice echoed from the main chamber, one of Blake's thugs. "Boss, there's a breeze coming from a crack in the wall over here. They went this way." "Then go get them," Blake roared. "And bring me what they're carrying." Jacob pushed Elena toward the narrow fissure. It was a tight squeeze, the rough rock tearing at their clothes. Behind them, they could hear Blake's men entering the chamber, cursing in the darkness. They scrambled through the winding, claustrophobic tunnel, the heavy satchel banging against Elena's side. They emerged into the cool night air by the creek, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding. In the distance, they could see torchlights spreading out from the ranch house as Blake's men began to search the property. "We have to get to the sheriff," Elena panted. "No," Jacob said, his eyes scanning the darkness. "The sheriff can't protect us from a man like Blake. Not tonight. We need to hide these, somewhere he would never dream of looking." He looked across the dark pasture, toward the small, fenced-off plot on the hill. A single weathered wooden cross stood against the starry sky. "Where?" Elena asked, her voice trembling. Jacob's voice was grim. "With the only other thing I ever tried to protect." He led her up the hill, to the grave of his wife Martha. With his bare hands, he dug into the soft earth beside the headstone. The voices from the artifacts seemed to whisper their approval. They were hiding the secrets of the past within the sorrow of his own. As they covered the satchel with dirt, the sounds of the search party grew closer. They had to run. They had to disappear into the night, leaving behind their home, their discovery, and the ghost of a woman who was now guarding a secret far older than her own memory. Dawn found them huddled in a rocky outcropping miles from the ranch, cold, exhausted, and terrified. They had watched from a distance as Blake's men ransacked the cabin and the tunnels, their torches like angry wasps swarming the property. "He'll never stop," Elena said, her voice hoarse. "Not as long as he thinks we have the plates." Jacob stared back in the direction of his home. "Then we have to make him believe we don't." His plan was desperate, a long shot born from fear and fury. They waited until mid-morning, then circled back, approaching the ranch from the south. The place was a wreck. His door was shattered, his furniture overturned. Blake's men were gone. Jacob went straight to the old well behind the barn. He found what he was looking for, a few old rusted metal plates he used for patching the roof. They were roughly the same size as the artifacts. He and Elena spent an hour scratching symbols onto them, crude copies of the ancient writing. Then he wrapped them in an old piece of oilcloth and dropped the bundle into his saddlebag. "This will never work," Elena said, her face etched with doubt. "It has to," Jacob replied. They rode hard for town, not to the sheriff's office, but to the saloon. It was the heart of the town's gossip, the place where whispers traveled faster than the telegraph. Jacob burst through the doors, looking wild-eyed and desperate. He slammed the decoy bundle on the bar. "Whiskey!" he growled, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I need to get out of this territory. I need a fast horse and a ticket on the next train east." A man who Jacob knew was on Blake's payroll looked up from his cards. "What's that you got there, Hartwell?" "My ticket out," Jacob said, unwrapping the rusted plates just enough for the man to see the strange markings. "Found 'em in that hole on my land. Blake wants 'em, he can have 'em. For a price. Tell him I'll be at the old abandoned depot at sundown, alone. He brings cash, or the deal's off." He downed the whiskey, slammed the glass on the bar, and stormed out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. "Jacob, this is suicide," Elena said as they mounted their horses. "He'll kill you." "He'll try," Jacob said, his jaw set. "But he wants those plates more than he wants me dead. He'll show up, and when he does, Sheriff Rodriguez will be waiting." They had sent a message to the sheriff with a local boy, telling him of the rendezvous. It was their only chance. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the plains, Jacob rode toward the skeletal remains of the old train depot. He felt strangely calm. For 3 years, he'd been running from a ghost. Tonight, he was facing a monster. And he wasn't alone. He dismounted, the decoy package in his hand, and waited. Soon, 2 riders appeared. It was Blake and one of his thugs. "Hartwell," Blake called out, "you made a wise decision." "The money first," Jacob said, his voice steady. Blake laughed. "You're in no position to make demands." He nodded to his man, who dismounted and walked toward Jacob, his hand on his gun. "Give me the plates." Jacob held the bundle tighter. "Not until I see the cash." The thug lunged for him. Jacob threw the package to the side and dove for cover behind a stack of rotting railroad ties. A gunshot exploded in the evening air. But it wasn't from the thug's gun. The man crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Sheriff Rodriguez stepped out from behind the depot, his rifle smoking. "It's over, Blake." Blake, still on his horse, stared in disbelief. Then his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He drew his own pistol, not aiming at the sheriff, but at Jacob. "If I can't have them, no one will," he screamed. Another shot rang out. Blake jerked in the saddle, his eyes wide with shock, and toppled to the ground. Holding a small, smoking pistol, her face pale but resolute, was Elena. She had followed him. She had saved his life. As the sheriff went to check on Blake, Jacob rushed to Elena. "You shouldn't have come." "You shouldn't have been so stupid," she shot back, but she was trembling. They stood there, the smoke of battle hanging in the air, the bodies of their enemies at their feet. It was over, but as the adrenaline faded, a new, more terrifying thought dawned on Jacob. Blake wasn't just a greedy businessman. He had mentioned connections, powerful people who wanted what was in that tunnel. They had won the battle. But Jacob had a sinking feeling the war was just beginning. The arrival of the U.S. Marshal felt less like a rescue and more like an invasion. Marshal Peters was a hard man with a cold face, and he arrived with a dozen armed deputies. They weren't there to congratulate Jacob and the sheriff. They were there to take over. "By order of the territorial governor," Peters announced, unrolling a scroll with an official seal. "This property and all its contents are hereby seized by the government of the United States. You folks are to vacate the premises immediately." Jacob stood on his porch, stunned into silence. Elena stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "You can't do this. This is a protected archaeological site." "According to whom?" Peters asked with a sneer. "According to you, Doctor? A woman with a fancy degree from back east? I have my orders." He gestured to his men, who began to set up a perimeter around the ranch. "We'll be conducting a full excavation. Thank you for your preliminary work." It was a nightmare. They had defeated Blake only to have everything stolen by the very people who were supposed to uphold the law. The sheriff argued, but Peters shut him down with a threat of federal obstruction charges. They were powerless. As they were being escorted off the property, one of the deputies, a young man who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation, spoke to Jacob in a low voice. "This ain't right," he muttered. "The governor is a major shareholder in the Montana Western Railroad. He and Blake were old friends." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This was never just about Blake. It was a conspiracy that went all the way to the top. They weren't just fighting a greedy man. They were fighting the entire system. They were forced to watch from a distance as Peter's men swarmed the tunnel, bringing in heavy equipment. The careful, respectful work that Elena had dreamed of was replaced by a crude, brutal plundering. They were ripping the secrets from the earth without any understanding or care. Despair washed over Jacob. He had failed. He had failed to protect the tunnel, just as he had failed to protect Martha. He was standing on a nearby hill with Elena and the sheriff, watching his life be torn apart once again, when he felt it. A low, deep hum. It wasn't in the air. It was in the ground, in the bones of the earth. "Another earthquake?" the sheriff asked, grabbing his hat. Elena's eyes went wide. "No," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the tunnel entrance. "It's not an earthquake." The humming grew louder, resonating in their chests. Down at the ranch, Peters's men stopped their work, looking around in confusion. Then, a low blue light began to pulse from the entrance to the tunnel. It pulsed in time with the deep, resonant hum, like a giant sleeping heart was waking up. The ground beneath the deputies began to glow, the ancient symbols carved deep in the earth becoming visible through the topsoil, shining with an eerie blue light. The deputies scrambled back in terror. Marshal Peters drew his weapon, shouting orders that were lost in the rising hum. Then, with a sound that wasn't a sound, more like a pressure change that Jacob felt in his soul, A wave of energy erupted from the tunnel. It wasn't violent. It didn't destroy anything. It just pushed. The deputies were thrown back, landing in heaps 100 yards away, unharmed but dazed. The heavy equipment stalled, the engines dying with a final, pathetic cough. The blue light intensified, forming a shimmering dome of energy over the entire site, centered on the tunnel entrance. The humming faded, leaving behind a profound silence. The ancient place had defended itself. It had drawn a line in the sand and declared itself off-limits. Jacob stared, awestruck. The whispers in his head had been a warning, but he now understood they were also a promise. He hadn't just found a tomb. He had found a guardian. And for some reason he couldn't comprehend, it had chosen him. Elena grabbed his hand, her face a mixture of terror and wonder. "Jacob," she breathed, "what have we found?" He didn't have an answer. He only knew that the world was far older and stranger than he had ever imagined. And the biggest secrets weren't buried in the past. They were waking up in the present. In the weeks that followed, the ranch became the most famous and most mysterious place in America. The story of the glowing dome and the repelled marshal spread like wildfire. Scientists, journalists, and government officials descended on the small Montana town, but no one could get within 100 yards of the tunnel. The shimmering blue shield remained, impenetrable and silent. Jacob and Elena were no longer outcasts. They were celebrities, the keepers of a mystery that had captivated the nation. The Smithsonian, embarrassed by the government's heavy-handed attempt to seize the site, sent a new representative, the esteemed Dr. Morrison. He didn't come with guns and warrants. He came with respect and an offer. He officially designated Jacob as the site's legal guardian and asked Elena to lead a federally funded, non-invasive research team. Their job was to study the phenomenon from the outside, to try and understand what they were dealing with. The disgraced governor was recalled, his connection to Blake and the railroad exposed in a national scandal. For the first time, it felt like they had truly won. Life settled into a new, strange routine. Tents and research equipment now dotted the landscape around the energy dome. Jacob found a new purpose, not just as a rancher, but as a protector, working with the researchers, sharing the knowledge he'd gleaned from his dreams and the whispers. He and Elena spent their days working side by side, their shared experience forging a bond deeper than either of them had ever known. One evening, as they stood watching the dome pulse softly in the twilight, Elena turned to him. "The plates," she said. "We never figured out what they said. We should bring them to Dr. Morrison." Jacob shook his head. "No, not yet." He led her up the hill to Martha's grave. Under the light of a full moon, he carefully unearthed the satchel. The metal plates felt warm, humming with the same energy as the dome. He handed one to Elena. As she took it, the symbols began to glow, and the whispers returned, not just to Jacob, but to her as well. This time, they weren't warnings. They were a history, a story of a people from the stars who had come to Earth millennia ago. They had built a network of energy sites, places of great power and knowledge. The chamber beneath his ranch was a library, a repository of their history, left behind when they had departed. But it was also a lock. It was designed to keep a destructive force, the shadow from the murals, from being unleashed. The gift was their knowledge. The curse was the entity they had imprisoned deep within the planet. The dome was a quarantine protocol, activated when the site was threatened by those with greedy or violent intentions. The place wasn't just defending itself, it was defending the entire world. They stood in stunned silence, the weight of their discovery settling upon them. This was bigger than a lost civilization. This was the story of humanity's secret past and its precarious future. "What do we do?" Elena whispered, her eyes wide. "We protect it," Jacob said, his voice filled with a certainty he hadn't felt in years. "We learn from it. And we get ready. Because if they left a lock, it means there's still a key." As he reburied the plates, his hand brushed against the cold stone of Martha's headstone. He had thought his life ended here, in this place of sorrow. He now realized it was where his life, his true life, had just begun. The lonely rancher was gone. In his place was a guardian, a man standing between a forgotten past and an unknown future, with the love of a remarkable woman by his side, ready for whatever came next. The autumn sun painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson. A year had passed. The blue dome still shimmered over the tunnel, a silent, beautiful mystery. The research station had grown into a small permanent community. Jacob and Elena were married in the spring, a simple ceremony on the porch of the rebuilt ranch house, witnessed by Dr. Morrison and the team of scientists who had become their family. The world had, for the most part, accepted the mystery. The site, now known as the Hartwell Anomaly, was a place of pilgrimage for thinkers, dreamers, and scientists. But for Jacob and Elena, it was simply home. They continued to study the plates in secret, the whispers slowly teaching them the language of the star people. They learned of science that looked like magic, of histories that stretched back before the Ice Age. One evening, as they sat on the porch, a telegraph arrived from Dr. Morrison, who was back in Washington. "They've found another one," Elena read aloud, her voice tense. "In the mountains of Peru. It's activating. The same energy signature." Jacob looked at the glowing dome, then at Elena. It wasn't over. It was a network, a system of planetary defense, waking up after a long sleep. "They want us to go," he said. It wasn't a question. "They want us to lead the expedition." Elena folded the telegram, her eyes shining with a mixture of excitement and fear. "Our whole lives, we've studied the past from a distance. Now, we're part of it." The lonely man who had been afraid of his own shadow was now being asked to travel the world, to uncover its oldest secrets. The quiet scholar who lived in books was now on the front lines of a discovery that would change humanity forever. He took her hand. "I spent 3 years thinking my life was over," he said quietly. "Turns out, I was just waiting for the right person to help me start living it." She leaned her head on his shoulder as they watched the stars begin to appear in the vast Montana sky. The silence that had once haunted this ranch was gone, replaced by the gentle hum of ancient power, and the quiet promise of a future filled with wonders they were only just beginning to understand. The earthquake hadn't just cracked open his land. It had cracked open the world. And for the first time, Jacob Hartwell felt ready to explore it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of the strange and the unexplained.